June 1940. A French beach littered with abandoned boots, rifles, helmets. The surf washing through discarded equipment like the tide of war itself. Over 300,000 British and French soldiers had just escaped across the English Channel in a desperate evacuation that saved an army but left behind almost everything it owned. Among the equipment abandoned on the beaches of Dunkirk were nearly all of Britain's heavy weapons, tanks, artillery pieces, and critically, hundreds of thousands of small arms. The British Expeditionary Force had limped home with its men, but without the means to fight. Britain now faced the very real possibility of German invasion with an army that had rifles for perhaps one soldier in 3. The Home Guard, that desperate assembly of civilians preparing to defend their island, drilled with broomsticks and pikes. In June 1940, Britain was essentially disarmed just as it needed weapons most desperately. It was in this moment of existential crisis that one of the most improbable weapons in military history was born. Not elegant like a Mauser, not prestigious like a Thompson, not refined like a Lee Enfield. This weapon would be crude, ugly, prone to jamming, and so simple it could be manufactured in bicycle shops. It would also become one of the most produced and distributed firearms of World War II, a symbol of resistance that would empower underground fighters from Norway to Greece, from France to Poland. This is the story of how a weapon that nobody wanted became the gun that helped liberate Europe. This is the story of the STEN. The crisis facing Britain in the summer of 1940 was multifaceted. The island nation stood alone against Nazi Germany after the fall of France. Invasion seemed imminent. German plans for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious assault on Britain, were being drawn up. Luftwaffe bombers were beginning their campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force and break British morale, and Britain had almost nothing with which to defend itself on the ground. The numbers were staggering. The British Army had lost 68,000 small arms at Dunkirk, including rifles, machine guns, and every submachine gun they possessed. British factories were producing rifles, but slowly, using traditional methods that required skilled machinists and time. Britain needed weapons immediately, not next year. The government turned first to America, purchasing Thompson's submachine guns at the astronomical price of $200 per unit. In 1940, that was more than 2 months' wages for an average worker. In today's money, each Thompson cost approximately $2,300. Britain was essentially bankrupting itself to arm its soldiers with American weapons, while its own factories struggled to keep pace with demand. The Thompson was a magnificent weapon, beautifully machined from solid steel, accurate, reliable, with excellent stopping power. It was also completely unsuitable for Britain's needs. Each Thompson required 40 hours of skilled labour to produce. It contained numerous finely machined parts. It was heavy, complex, and expensive. Britain needed the opposite. It needed something that could be made quickly by semi-skilled workers in existing factories without disrupting production of more complex weapons systems. It needed something cheap enough to produce by the tens of thousands, and it needed something simple enough that resistance fighters with minimal training could use and maintain it. What Britain needed was not a precision instrument. It needed a crude, functional tool for killing at close range. In August 1940, the British government made the decision to produce a copy of the German MP-28 submachine gun, ordering 50,000 units. This weapon, known as the Lanchester, was a solid design, but it still required skilled labour and expensive materials. It would take months to tool up for production. Meanwhile, designers at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield were working on something radically different. Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin, both experienced weapons designers, had been examining captured German MP-38 and MP-40 submachine guns. They noticed something interesting. These German weapons, while well designed, were still relatively complex. They wondered if it was possible to strip away everything that wasn't absolutely essential and create a weapon that was nothing more than a tube that fired bullets. The two men began sketching designs in late 1940, working with extraordinary urgency. Every day Britain remained essentially disarmed was another day closer to possible invasion and defeat. What Shepherd and Turpin created was revolutionary in its simplicity. The STEN, its name derived from the first letters of their surnames in Enfield, was essentially a metal tube with a bolt, a trigger mechanism, a magazine, and almost nothing else. The designers had eliminated everything that required skilled machining or complex manufacturing. The receiver was a simple steel tube. The barrel was a piece of pipe. The The stock was a skeletal frame of welded metal tubing. There was no wood anywhere on the weapon. The trigger mechanism was so simple, it contained fewer parts than a mousetrap. The entire weapon could be broken down into just a handful of components, none of which required precision manufacturing beyond the bolt and barrel. The prototype was tested in January 1941, and the results were promising enough that the government ordered immediate production of what would become the Mark I STEN. But even the Mark I, which entered limited production in 1941, was considered too complex. It featured a forward grip, a flash hider, and a folding stock that still required some skilled fabrication. Designers went back to the drawing board and created something even more brutal in its simplicity. The STEN Mark II, which entered mass production in 1941, was a masterpiece of minimalist design. It consisted of 48 parts. The entire weapon weighed 7 pounds empty, 9 pounds loaded. It was 30 inches long with a 7.5-inch barrel. It fired from an open bolt using simple blowback operation, meaning there was no gas system, no complex mechanisms, nothing that could break easily. The rate of fire was approximately 550 rounds per minute, though this varied depending on the condition of the magazine spring. The magazine held 32 rounds of 9mm parabellum ammunition, though soldiers quickly learned to load only 30 to reduce the risk of jamming. The most distinctive feature of the STEN was its side-mounted magazine, copied directly from the German MP-38. This made the weapon easily recognizable and allowed it to be held more easily while prone. The sights were rudimentary, a simple fixed rear aperture and a front post set for 100 yards. Accuracy beyond this range was poor, but the STEN was never intended for long-range precision. It was designed for close-quarters combat, for ambushes, for fighting in streets and buildings where engagements happened at ranges measured in feet, not yards. The cost was what made the STEN truly revolutionary. Each Mark II cost approximately £2 and 10 shillings to produce. $10. A tenth the cost of an American Thompson. A 20th the cost of a German MC-40. This wasn't just cheaper, it was an entirely different category of affordability. Britain could produce STEN guns in numbers that would have been impossible with conventional weapons. The manufacturing process was equally revolutionary. The STEN was designed to be produced using stamped metal parts that required minimal welding. Components could be manufactured by companies that had never made weapons before. Piano factories, bicycle manufacturers, toy companies, all were enlisted to produce STEN parts. Small workshops could manufacture components that were then assembled at central facilities. This distributed production model meant that bombing a single factory wouldn't significantly impact STEN production. The weapon was designed for mass production in a way that no previous firearm had been. Production numbers tell the story. In 1941, Britain produced approximately 20,000 STEN guns. In 1942, production reached 300,000. By 1943, British factories were producing nearly 900,000 STEN guns per year. Over the course of World War II, approximately 4 million S-10 guns in various marks were manufactured, making it the second most produced submachine gun of the war, after the Soviet PPSH-41. The speed of production was equally impressive. A skilled worker could assemble a STEN from components in less than 5 hours. Factories operating 3 shifts could produce hundreds of weapons daily. The STEN's simplicity also meant that field repairs were straightforward. Soldiers could disassemble and reassemble the weapon in less than a minute with no tools. Broken parts could often be replaced by cannibalizing damaged weapons. This field serviceability made the STEN ideal for partisan and resistance use, where access to gunsmiths and spare parts was non-existent. But the STEN had one critical flaw that would haunt it throughout the war: the magazine. The side-mounted 32-round magazine was copied from the German MP-38, and like that weapon's magazine, it was prone to feeding problems. The 9mm parabellum cartridges had to be arranged in a double-stack staggered configuration within the magazine. In a side-loading weapon, this meant that dirt, mud, or deformation of the magazine lips could cause failures to feed. The magazine spring also required careful maintenance. If the spring lost tension, rounds wouldn't feed properly. If the magazine was dented or bent, which happened frequently in combat conditions, it would jam. Soldiers quickly learned never to load more than 30 rounds in the 32-round magazine, as the extra spring tension from a full load increased the likelihood of jams. They also learned never to use the magazine as a hand grip. despite the temptation. Holding the weapon by the magazine could cause misfeeds by putting pressure on the magazine housing. The proper method for holding the STEN was with the offhand forward of the magazine, gripping the barrel jacket. This was counterintuitive and uncomfortable, which is why many soldiers ignored this guidance and held the magazine anyway, contributing to the weapon's reputation for unreliability. Later variants, particularly the Mark V, would include a forward grip to encourage proper handling. But in 1941 and 1942, soldiers receiving the Mark II had to learn through trial and error how to keep their STENs functioning. The magazine problem was exacerbated by the weapon's simplicity. There was no dust cover over the ejection port. The open bolt design meant that dirt could enter the receiver easily. In the mud of Italian battlefields or the dust of North Africa, STEN guns could become clogged with debris that caused malfunctions. Soldiers learned to keep their weapons as clean as possible, but in combat conditions this wasn't always feasible. The STEN's reputation for jamming would become legendary, sometimes with tragic consequences. British troops initially despised the weapon. Soldiers who had trained on Lee Enfield rifles, beautiful pieces of engineering with walnut stocks and blued steel, looked at the STEN with disgust. It felt cheap because it was cheap. It looked crude because it was crude. Many soldiers felt they were being issued a weapon that reflected how little their government valued their lives. The crude finish, with visible weld marks and stamped metal that sometimes had rough edges, seemed almost insulting compared to German or American weapons. Nicknames proliferated. Soldiers called it the stench gun, the plumber's nightmare, the Woolworth gun, after the British chain store known for cheap goods. One particularly creative soldier dubbed it the Stinker, Tommy Tickler, and the 2-bob special, referring to its £2 10-shilling cost. Yet despite its flaws and its terrible reputation among regular troops, the STEN would prove itself in combat again and again. The weapon saw its first significant action in North Africa in 1942, where British commandos and tank crews used it in close quarters fighting. The desert environment was harsh on the STEN. Sand and dust infiltrated every mechanism. Soldiers learned to wrap their weapons in cloth and to clean them obsessively. Those who maintained their STENs properly found that despite its crude appearance, the weapon was remarkably effective in combat. At ranges under 100 yards, their STEN was devastating. The 9mm Center parabellum round, while not as powerful as rifle cartridges, was perfectly adequate for killing or incapacitating at close range. The weapon's lightweight made it easy to swing onto target quickly. The relatively slow rate of fire compared to weapons like the German MP40, which fired at 500 to 550 rounds per minute, made it more controllable. Soldiers found that with proper trigger discipline, they could fire accurate short bursts that conserved ammunition and kept the weapon on target. The STEN's greatest strength was its availability. British soldiers might despise the weapon, but they had it, and in large numbers. By 1943, STEN guns were being issued to tank crews who needed a combat weapon for close defence, to paratroopers who needed something that could be broken down and carried in a jump bag, to commandos who operated behind enemy lines, and increasingly to infantry sergeants and corporals who needed more firepower than a rifle could provide. Lieutenant Alan Lee of the Parachute Regiment described the weapon in a post-war interview. When you went into a village or went into a house, whatever it was a reliable weapon. It wasn't a reliable instrument for anything over 100 yards, but for anything close quarters it was very reliable. That assessment, reliable at close quarters, captured the essence of the STEN. It was never meant to be a precision instrument. It was meant to be a close-range killer that could be produced in enormous numbers, and at this, it excelled. But the STEN's real destiny wasn't in the hands of British Regular Army troops. Its true purpose would be revealed when it began to be distributed to resistance movements across occupied Europe, and it was here, in the hands of partisans, underground fighters, and desperate civilians, that the crude British submachine gun would become a symbol of resistance and hope. In July 1940, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill created the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, with a mandate to, as Churchill put it, set Europe ablaze. The SOE's mission was to support and supply resistance movements in Nazi-occupied territories, to conduct sabotage operations, and to prepare underground networks for eventual Allied liberation. A critical component of this mission was supplying weapons to resistance fighters. The STEN was perfect for this purpose. The weapon could be easily disassembled into components small enough to fit in a suitcase or shopping basket. The barrel could be removed without tools, the skeletal stock could be detached, the entire weapon could be broken down in seconds and hidden in ways that a conventional rifle could not. For resistance fighters constantly at risk of German searches, this concealability was invaluable. Beginning in 1942, the RAF and later the USAF began dropping weapons containers to resistance groups across Europe. These containers, dropped by parachute during nighttime missions, contained STEN guns, ammunition, explosives, and other supplies. The STEN Mark II became the primary submachine gun delivered to resistance movements, with over 85,000 delivered to France alone by 1944. The drops were dangerous and often inaccurate. Containers landed in trees, in rivers, in German-controlled territory. Resistance fighters had to locate and retrieve them quickly before German patrols could investigate. The recovery operations themselves were acts of extreme courage, conducted under constant risk of discovery and execution. The STEN changed the nature of resistance operations. Before its widespread distribution, resistance groups were armed primarily with hunting rifles, old weapons cached from previous wars, and occasionally captured German weapons. These were inadequate for offensive operations. Resistance groups could conduct acts of sabotage, gather intelligence, operate safe houses, but they couldn't effectively engage German troops in firefights. The STEN, despite its flaws, gave resistance fighters a weapon that could kill German soldiers at close range. It gave them the ability to conduct ambushes, to attack collaborators, to raid for supplies and weapons. It transformed passive resistance into active armed struggle. In France, the maquis, rural resistance groups who lived rough in forests and mountains, received thousands of STEN guns throughout 1943 and 1944. A French resistance fighter later recalled receiving his first STEN. Early in July, we received our first STEN machine gun. We kept taking it apart and putting it together until we could do it in record time. Then the gun was passed from one camp to another. This practice, sharing a single weapon among multiple groups to train fighters in its operation, was common. A single STEN could train dozens of resistance fighters before additional weapons arrived. The training emphasized the weapon's simplicity. There were no complicated mechanisms to learn. Point, pull the trigger, shoot. Even fighters with no previous firearms experience could become proficient with the STEN after firing a single magazine. The French resistance employed the STEN extensively in preparing for D-Day and in the liberation of France. Maquis groups armed with STENs conducted hundreds of attacks on German supply lines, destroying railway infrastructure, ambushing convoys, and tying down German troops who might otherwise have been sent to oppose the Normandy invasion. During the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the French resistance played a crucial role in delaying German reinforcements. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed in southern France, was ordered to Normandy to help repel the invasion. The journey should have taken 3 days. It took 17. Throughout their journey, Das Reich was harassed constantly by Maquis fighters armed with STEN guns and explosives. Bridges were blown, roads were blocked, small Unit S were ambushed. The Germans were forced to fight their way north, and by the time they reached Normandy, the division had suffered significant casualties, and the critical window for counterattacking the beachhead had closed. Allied commanders estimated that the French resistance, armed largely with weapons like the STEN, provided the equivalent of 10 to 15 divisions worth of combat power during the liberation of France. General Eisenhower himself credited the resistance with significantly shortening the war. But the distribution of STEN guns to resistance movements came at a terrible cost. The Germans knew that resistance fighters were being supplied with British weapons. They responded with savage reprisals. Villages suspected of harbouring resistance fighters were destroyed. Civilians found with weapons were executed immediately. The penalties for mere possession of a STEN were severe. In Poland, the STEN played a central role in the tragic Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, had received British weapons drops throughout 1943 and 1944, including STEN guns. But the quantities were never sufficient for the size of the resistance movement. Polish ingenuity provided a solution. If Britain couldn't supply enough STEN guns, the Poles would manufacture their own. By 1943, at least 23 underground workshops in Warsaw were producing copies of the STEN Mark II. These Polish STENs, marked with the Polish eagle and the designation PM for pistole maszynowe, machine pistol, were manufactured in conditions of extraordinary danger. Parts were produced in small machine shops scattered across the city. Barrels were created by boring out old rifle barrels and cutting new rifling. Metal tubing was scavenged from bombed buildings. The work was done in basements and back rooms, with lookouts posted to warn of German patrols. The quality of these clandestine STENs varied wildly. Some were nearly as good as British factory productions. Others were crude but functional. All of them represented an extraordinary act of defiance. The Poles also developed their own submachine gun inspired by the STEN, the błyskawica, meaning lightning. Designed by two Polish engineers with no previous firearms experience, Wacław Zawrotny and Seweryn Wielenia, the błyskawica combined the exterior appearance of the German MP40 with the internal mechanism of the STEN. Between 500 and 700 błyskawica guns were produced before the Warsaw Uprising. On August 1, 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising began, the Home Army had approximately 45,000 fighters. Only about 1 in 6 had any weapon at all. Many of those weapons were STEN guns, either British supplied or locally manufactured. The uprising, which was intended to last a few days until Soviet forces entered the city, instead continued for 63 days of brutal urban combat. The Germans brought in heavy artillery and air power. They systematically destroyed the city block by block. Polish fighters armed with STEN guns and improvised weapons fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. The clandestinely produced STEN guns and błyskawica submachine guns kept firing even as ammunition ran critically low. Fighters made desperate attempts to manufacture their own ammunition in underground workshops. The uprising ultimately failed. The Soviets, who had reached the outskirts of Warsaw, deliberately halted their advance and allowed the Germans to crush the resistance. By October 1944, 200,000 Polish civilians were dead, along with 16,000 resistance fighters. Warsaw was reduced to rubble, but the STEN guns used in that uprising became symbols of Polish resistance and courage. Today, examples of Polish-manufactured STEN guns are displayed in museums as sacred relics of Poland's struggle for freedom. The sacrifices made by the underground workers who produced these weapons, often executed when their workshops were discovered, are commemorated as acts of national heroism. In Denmark and Norway, resistance fighters also manufactured their own copies of the STEN using locally sourced materials. Danish resistance groups produced several variants, including one designed to use Finnish Suomi magazines. The Ring and STEN used aluminum castings manufactured in small workshops. Norwegian resistance fighters, operating in some of the harshest terrain in Europe, found the STEN ideal for their guerrilla operations. The weapon's simplicity meant it could function even in extreme cold, and its lightweight made it easier to carry during long movements through mountains and forests. The fact that the STEN could be manufactured by resistance groups with minimal equipment spoke to the genius of its design. Shepard and Turpin had created a weapon so fundamentally simple that it could be replicated in conditions ranging from British factories to Polish basements to Norwegian mountain workshops. The STEN had become democratized. Any group with basic metalworking capability could arm itself. But perhaps the most controversial moment in STEN history occurred not in a major battle, but in a Prague street in May 1942. Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich, would demonstrate both the STEN's potential and its most critical weakness. Reinhard Heydrich was one of the most powerful and evil men in Nazi Germany. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, he was one of the principal architects of the Holocaust. As acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, he ruled occupied Czechoslovakia with brutal efficiency, executing hundreds and deporting thousands more. The British Special Operations Executive and the Czechoslovak government in exile selected Heydrich as a target for assassination. The operation would demonstrate that Nazi leaders were not untouchable and would provide a propaganda victory for the resistance. 2 Czech soldiers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, were trained in Britain and parachuted into Czechoslovakia in December 1941. They carried with them STEN guns, pistols, and modified anti-tank grenades. The plan was to ambush Heydrich's car at a sharp curve where the vehicle would have to slow down. On the morning of May 27, 1942, Heydrich left his residence for a meeting in Prague. He travelled in an open-topped Mercedes with only his driver as security, displaying the arrogant confidence that had earned him the nickname the Butcher of Prague. As the car slowed to negotiate the curve, Gabčík stepped into the road, dropped his raincoat, raised his STEN gun and squeezed the trigger. The gun jammed. For a moment that must have felt like an eternity. Gabčík stood in the street holding a useless weapon, while Heydrich stood up in his car and drew his Luger pistol. The assassination should have ended there in complete failure and the immediate deaths of the assassins. But Heydrich made a fatal error. Instead of ordering his driver to accelerate away, he commanded him to stop. He intended to personally confront the attacker. This moment of arrogance gave Kubiš time to act. He threw his modified grenade at the car. It detonated against the rear wheel, sending fragments of metal and horsehair upholstery deep into Heydrich's body. The Nazi officer was mortally wounded. He would die a week later from sepsis as the wounds became infected. But the STEN's failure at the critical moment has haunted the weapon's history ever since. Why did Gabčík's STEN jam? The most likely explanation is that the weapon wasn't properly maintained. The STEN's open bolt design meant that moisture or dirt could infiltrate the mechanism. If the bolt wasn't kept clean and lightly oiled, it could stick. Gabčík had been carrying the concealed weapon for hours under a raincoat on a damp morning. Condensation may have caused the bolt to stick in the forward position. Alternatively, the magazine may have been improperly loaded or the lip slightly deformed. The STEN's magazine problems could manifest at the worst possible moment. In retrospect, the assassination succeeded despite the STEN's failure, not because of it. But the incident highlighted the weapon's critical weakness. In the moment when reliability mattered most, the STEN had failed. The consequences of Heydrich's assassination were catastrophic. The Nazis launched a massive manhunt. Gabčík and Kubiš, along with other resistance fighters, took refuge in an Orthodox church in Prague. They were betrayed, and 800 SS and Gestapo troops besieged the church. The Czech fighters, armed only with pistols, held out for hours before, committing suicide rather than surrender. The Germans then exacted terrible revenge. The village of Lidis was selected for reprisal. Every male over the age of 16 was shot. Women and children were sent to concentration camps. The village was burned to the ground and the earth was ploughed and salted so nothing would grow there. The village of Ležáky suffered the same fate. In total, approximately 5,000 Czech civilians were killed in reprisals for Heydrich's assassination. The STEN's failure at the critical moment didn't prevent the assassination's success, but it has forever linked the weapon to this moment of mechanical failure with world historical consequences. Despite this infamous failure, the STEN continued to be refined and improved throughout the war. The Mark III variant, produced beginning in 1942, simplified the design even further by eliminating the removable barrel and using a welded receiver. It was even cheaper to produce than the Mark II, requiring only 48 parts compared to the Mark II's 69. However, the non-removable barrel was seen as a disadvantage, and the Mark II remained the most commonly produced variant. The Mark V, introduced in late 1943, represented an attempt to make the STEN more refined and soldier-friendly. It featured a wooden pistol grip, a wooden stock, a forward vertical grip, and improved sights. It could even mount a bayonet. The Mark V was issued primarily to British airborne forces and made its combat debut during Operation Market Garden in September 1944. It was heavier and more expensive than the Mark II, costing about 3 times as much to produce, but it was far more pleasant to handle and somewhat more reliable. The Mark VI, a suppressed version of the Mark V, was produced in small numbers for commando and SOE use. The suppressor reduced the weapon's muzzle velocity to subsonic levels, making it extremely quiet. With the suppressor engaged, the loudest sound was the bolt cycling. This made the Mark VI ideal for covert operations, sentries elimination, and close-range assassinations. The silenced STEN became legendary in special operations circles, though only a few thousand were produced. Throughout its production run, the STEN was also manufactured in Canada at the Long Branch Arsenal. Canadian-produced STEN guns were generally considered to be of better quality than British-manufactured weapons, with superior fit and finish. This was partly because Canadian factories weren't under constant threat of German bombing and had more time to refine their production processes. Approximately 134,000 STEN Mark II guns were manufactured in Canada, along with 1 million magazines. The Canadian STEN guns saw extensive use in the Pacific Theatre, where Canadian forces found them effective in jungle warfare despite the harsh, humid conditions. By 1944, the STEN had become ubiquitous across Allied forces. British, Canadian and Polish troops carried them. American OSS agents used them for covert operations. Chinese forces received thousands through the Long Branch factory. New Zealand and Australian forces manufactured their own variants. The weapon had spread across the entire Allied war effort. The effectiveness of the STEN in the hands of resistance fighters became clear during the liberation of Europe. During the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, British paratroopers armed with STEN Mark V guns fought desperately against overwhelming German forces. The weapon's reliability under extreme combat conditions impressed even skeptical soldiers. In Italy, partisan fighters armed with STEN guns harassed German forces throughout 1943 and 1944. In Greece, resistance groups used STEN guns to conduct operations against both German occupiers and rival partisan factions in the complex Greek civil conflict. The Germans, ironically, were so impressed by the STEN's simplicity and effectiveness that they manufactured their own copies. The MP3008, produced in the final months of the War for the Volkssturm, Germany's desperate last-ditch home defence force, was an almost exact copy of the STEN Mark II with only minor modifications. Several 100,000 were produced in the chaos of late 1944 and early 1945. The fact that Germany, which had produced some of the finest weapons of the war, resorted to copying the crude British STEN speaks volumes about the design's effectiveness. The MP3008 was intended for guerrilla warfare against Allied forces as Germany collapsed, though the war ended before most could be distributed. After the war, the STEN story continued. The weapon saw extensive use during the Korean War, where British Commonwealth forces found it adequate for the close-quarters combat that characterised much of that conflict. However, soldiers continued to dislike it, preferring to acquire American M1 carbines or M3 grease guns when possible. The STEN's greatest post-war impact was in conflicts of decolonization and insurgency. During the Malayan Emergency, both British forces and communist insurgents used STEN guns. Caches of STEN guns that had been airdropped to resistance fighters during World War II found their way into the hands of anti-colonial movements. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau uprising, STEN guns were used by both British security forces and insurgents. The Irish Republican Army acquired STEN guns in significant numbers, using them in operations throughout the Troubles in Northern Ireland. STEN guns appeared in conflicts across the Middle East, Africa and Asia, testament to both their durability and their widespread distribution during the war. Perhaps the most significant post-war use of the STEN was during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. The Israeli forces, desperately short of weapons, manufactured their own copies of the STEN in underground workshops. These locally produced weapons, remarkably similar to the Polish underground STENs of Warsaw, armed the forces that would establish the State of Israel. The legacy of the STEN is complex. As a weapon, it was deeply flawed. The magazine was unreliable. The open bolt design allowed dirt and moisture to enter the mechanism. The crude finish and minimal training required to produce it meant that quality varied widely. Soldiers who carried it often despised it as cheap and unreliable. Yet the STEN accomplished everything it was designed to do. It was produced in enormous numbers, over 4 million by war's end. It could be manufactured quickly and cheaply, allowing Britain to arm itself during its darkest hour. It could be easily concealed and maintained, making it ideal for resistance use. At close range, where most combat actually occurred, it was devastatingly effective. Most importantly, it was available. When Britain faced invasion in 1940, the STEN gave the Home Guard and regular army a weapon to fight with. When resistance movements across Europe needed arms, the STEN was what Britain could supply in the quantities needed. The weapon's very cheapness and simplicity, the qualities that soldiers found so offensive, were what made it possible to distribute weapons on a scale never before achieved. The STEN's influence on subsequent weapon design was profound. The concept of a simplified, stamped metal submachine gun suitable for mass production influenced the development of weapons like the American M3 grease gun and the later Sterling submachine gun that replaced the STEN in British service. The idea that a weapon could be reduced to its most essential components and still function effectively challenged traditional thinking about firearms design. The STEN represented industrial pragmatism over craftsmanship, function over form, quantity over quality. This philosophy would influence military procurement for generations. Modern infantry weapons are manufactured using similar principles of simplified design and stamped components. The STEN, in this sense, was ahead of its time. It anticipated an era where weapons would be tools rather than precision instruments, where replaceability mattered more than heirloom quality. For resistance fighters across occupied Europe, the STEN represented something more than a weapon. It represented hope. When a parachute container landed in a French forest or a Polish basement workshop completed another crude copy, it meant that Britain hadn't abandoned them. It meant they had the means to fight back. The STEN, for all its flaws, embodied the determination of people who refused to accept occupation and tyranny. The price of resistance was terrible. France lost nearly 10,000 resistance fighters killed in action, with another 20,000 executed after capture and 80,000 deported to concentration camps and death. Poland's losses were even more catastrophic, with tens of thousands of resistance fighters killed and entire cities destroyed in reprisals. The STEN didn't make resistance safe, but it made resistance possible. It gave ordinary people, shopkeepers and teachers and farmers, the means to become soldiers in a war against occupation. The crude British submachine gun that emerged from desperation in 1940 became one of the defining weapons of World War II, not because it was elegant or well-made or beloved by its users, but because it was cheap, simple, and available in the quantities needed to arm a resistance movement that spanned an entire continent. The STEN story is ultimately about the triumph of industrial pragmatism and the power of simplicity. Major Reginald Shepherd and Harold Turpin, working under desperate time pressure, created a weapon that represented everything traditional gunsmiths despised. Yet that crude weapon armed millions, empowered resistance, and helped liberate Europe. Today, STEN guns are collector's items, museum pieces, relics of a war that ended 80 years ago. But for those who carried them, who hid them in shopping baskets and dismantled them in church basements, and fired them at German patrols in midnight ambushes, the STEN was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of defiance, a tool of liberation, and proof that sometimes the simplest solution is the right one. The flying milk bottle of submachine guns had done its job, and Europe was free. The STEN's combat record in regular military operations deserves deeper examination, for while its role in resistance movements captured the imagination, it was in conventional warfare that the weapon's true character emerged. British commandos were among the first to appreciate the STEN's qualities. The weapon's light weight made it ideal for amphibious operations where every pound mattered. During the raid on Saint-Nazaire in March 1942, commandos armed with STEN guns fought their way through German defences to destroy the massive dry dock that could service the battleship Tirpitz. The close quarters fighting in warehouses and on docks played to the STEN's strengths. German defenders armed with rifles and machine guns found themselves at a disadvantage in the chaotic melee. The STEN's rapid fire and compact size allowed commandos to clear rooms and corridors with devastating efficiency. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman, commanding the raid, noted in his after-action report that the STEN guns had performed admirably despite concerns about reliability. The key, he emphasised, was proper maintenance and understanding the weapon's limitations. Commandos who kept their magazines clean and loaded to only 30 rounds experienced few malfunctions. Those who neglected these precautions paid the price. The raid succeeded in its objective, though at terrible cost. Of the 611 men who participated, 169 were killed and 215 captured. But the STEN had proven itself in some of the most intense close-quarters combat of the war. The weapon's reputation began to shift, at least among special operations forces who understood how to employ it effectively. The Dieppe raid in August 1942 provided another test. Canadian forces attempting to seize the French port were armed with a mixture of Lee-Enfield rifles and STEN guns. The raid was a disaster, with Canadian forces pinned down on the beaches under withering German fire. But in the street fighting that occurred before the evacuation, STEN-armed troops demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness in urban combat. Sergeant Pierre Dubuc of the Fusiliers Mont-Royal fought his way through Dieppe's streets with a STEN gun, engaging German defenders in buildings and alleyways. He later described the weapon as crude but effective when used properly. The problem, he noted, wasn't the gun itself, but the lack of training. Many Canadian soldiers had received their STENs only weeks before the raid and hadn't had time to become proficient with them. They didn't understand the importance of magazine maintenance or proper handling technique. Those who did understand these things found the STEN deadly at close range. By 1943, British and Commonwealth forces had developed doctrine for STEN employment that maximised its effectiveness while mitigating its weaknesses. Squad tactics emphasised the STEN as a close-range weapon to complement rifle fire. Infantry sections typically included 1 or 2 men armed with STENs, usually the section leader and a designated automatic rifleman. These men were trained to engage targets at ranges under 100 yards, while riflemen provided longer-range fire. The doctrine emphasised fire discipline. The STEN's limited magazine capacity compared to belt-fed machine guns meant that sustained fire was impossible. Soldiers were taught to fire short, controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds rather than extended bursts that would empty the magazine in seconds. In North Africa, the STEN saw extensive use during the final campaigns against Axis forces. The weapon proved surprisingly effective in desert conditions when properly maintained. British and Commonwealth troops learned to keep their STENs wrapped in cloth to prevent sand infiltration. Before each engagement, soldiers would check their weapons, clearing any sand from the Bolton magazine. The non-Nasiomimis parabellum cartridge, while not powerful enough to penetrate the armour of German vehicles, was perfectly adequate against personnel. During the Battle of Mareth Line in March 1943, British infantry armed with STENs engaged German defenders in prepared positions. The close-range fighting in Wadis and around fortified positions saw extensive use of submachine guns. Private James Mitchell of the Gordon Highlanders described clearing German bunkers with a STEN. You'd throw a grenade, then go in firing. The STEN was perfect for that. Light enough to handle while scrambling through narrow entrances, fast-firing enough to suppress anyone who survived the grenade. The reliability problems everyone talked about, I never experienced them. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe I just took care of my weapon. The Italian campaign, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, provided ideal terrain for STEN employment. The mountainous landscape and ancient villages created countless opportunities for close-quarters combat. British and Canadian forces fighting their way up the Italian peninsula found the STEN invaluable in village fighting. The narrow streets and stone buildings of Italian towns channeled combat into intimate, deadly encounters where submachine guns dominated. During the Battle of Ortona in December 1943, Canadian forces engaged in brutal house-to-house fighting against German paratroopers. The battle, later called Little Stalingrad, saw some of the most intense urban combat of the war. STEN guns proved essential for room clearing and close-range engagements in the rubble-filled streets. Corporal Jim Stone of the Loyal Edmonton Regiment described the fighting. You'd blow a hole in a wall, throw in grenades, then go through firing. The STEN was the only weapon that made sense for that kind of work. A rifle was too long, too slow. The STEN let you get rounds on target fast. We'd go through buildings room by room, STENs blazing. It was terrifying and exhausting, but the weapon never let us down. The Battle of Monte Cassino, fought between January and May 1944, saw STEN guns used in conditions that would have destroyed more delicate weapons. The mountainous terrain, winter weather, and intense combat tested equipment to its limits. British, Indian, and New Zealand troops climbing the steep slopes around the monastery found the STEN's lightweight advantageous. When fighting reached the monastery itself, the close-quarters combat in ruins and corridors made submachine guns essential. The Polish II Corps, which finally captured Monte Cassino in May 1944, was partially armed with STEN guns supplied by the British. Polish soldiers, many of whom had experience with the weapon from underground manufacturing in Warsaw, appreciated its simplicity and effectiveness. They understood that the STEN was never meant to be a precision instrument. It was meant to deliver rapid fire at close range, and at this it excelled. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944 saw thousands of STEN guns come ashore with British and Canadian forces. Paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, dropped behind enemy lines hours before the main invasion, carried STEN Mark V guns that could be broken down and carried in jump bags. The lightweight weapon was ideal for airborne operations where every ounce mattered. Major John Howard, leading the glider assault on Pegasus Bridge, armed his men with STEN guns for the close quarters, fighting expected in seizing the bridge. The operation succeeded brilliantly, with the bridge captured intact in minutes of intense fighting. The STEN's rapid fire proved decisive in overwhelming the German defenders before they could destroy the bridge. Howard later praised the weapon. noting that while it lacked the refinement of traditional British firearms, it was exactly what was needed for commando operations. On the beaches themselves, STEN guns were less useful. The fighting was at longer ranges where rifles dominated. But as British and Canadian forces pushed inland and fighting moved into the hedgerows of Normandy, the STEN came into its own. The bocage country of Normandy, with its dense hedgerows and small fields, created a nightmarish combat environment. Visibility was limited to yards. Engagements happened suddenly at ranges where submachine guns were ideal. British infantry learned to move through the hedgerows with STEN gunners leading, ready to engage any Germans who appeared suddenly from the dense vegetation. The fighting in Normandy was brutal and attritional. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but the STEN armed troops held their own against German forces equipped with superior weapons like the MP40 and the devastating MG42 machine gun. The British weapon's simplicity meant that even when damaged, it could often be repaired in the field. Armourers with infantry units became expert at fixing STENs using parts cannibalized from destroyed weapons. The Battle of Caen, fought throughout July 1944, saw intense urban combat reminiscent of Ortona. British and Canadian forces fought German SS troops in the ruins of the ancient French city. STEN guns were essential for clearing buildings and engaging in the close-range firefights that characterized urban warfare. The weapons magazine problems persisted, and soldiers continued to complain about reliability, but those who understood proper handling technique found it effective. As Allied forces broke out from Normandy and raced across France in August 1944, STEN guns were used increasingly in hasty actions and meeting engagements. The rapid advance created fluid battlefield conditions where light, mobile weapons were advantageous. Motorized infantry and reconnaissance units found the STEN perfect for their needs. Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the ambitious attempt to seize bridges across the Netherlands and advance into Germany, saw extensive STEN use. British airborne forces dropped at Arnhem were armed primarily with STEN Mark V guns. The 9-day battle that followed became one of the most famous disasters of the war. British paratroopers, isolated and surrounded, fought desperately against overwhelming German forces. The STEN guns performed well in the close-range fighting in Arnhem's suburbs, but the weapon's limited range meant that British forces were at a disadvantage in more open terrain, where German infantry weapons could engage at longer distances. Major Robert Kane, who earned the Victoria Cross at Arnhem, used a STEN gun throughout the battle, while also operating as an improvised anti-tank gunner with Piats. He later recalled that the STEN was reliable when kept clean, but the constant movement and combat made maintenance difficult. Weapons became fouled with dirt and carbon buildup, increasing the rate of malfunctions. Despite this, the STENs kept firing, and British paratroopers inflicted heavy casualties on German forces before being forced to surrender or withdraw. The winter of 1944-45 saw British and Canadian forces fighting in some of the worst conditions of the war. The Battle of the Scheldt, fought to open the approaches to Antwerp, involved combat in flooded polders and fortified positions. STEN guns were exposed to water, mud, and freezing temperatures. Reliability suffered. Soldiers learned to keep their weapons as dry as possible, but in the conditions of the Scheldt, this was nearly impossible. The STEN's open bolt design, which allowed moisture to enter the mechanism, became a significant liability. Weapons would freeze or become clogged with mud, requiring constant cleaning and maintenance. Yet the weapon continued to function, after a fashion. Soldiers would heat their STENs over fires to thaw frozen mechanisms, clean them frantically between engagements, and curse their crude construction. But when the fighting started, the STENs fired and men stayed alive. During the Rhine crossings in March 1945, British forces used STEN guns extensively in the assault across Germany's last major natural barrier. Commandos and paratroopers leading the crossings carried STENs for close-quarters work. The weapon proved effective in the chaotic fighting on the river's eastern bank. As Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, the nature of combat changed. German resistance became increasingly desperate and fanatical. Hitler Youth and Volkssturm units, armed with improvised weapons and captured equipment, fought in villages and towns across Germany. British troops clearing these defended positions relied heavily on STNs for room clearing and close-range engagements. The weapon's simplicity was an advantage in the final weeks of the war. Supply lines were stretched, and maintenance facilities were left far behind advancing forces. The STEN could be kept running with minimal support, using parts scavenged from damaged weapons. Armourers became expert at field repairs, replacing broken firing pins, springs, and other small parts to keep weapons operational. The discovery of concentration camps in April 1945 brought a new dimension to the STEN story. British soldiers liberating Bergen-Belsen and other camps were armed with STEN guns. The crude British submachine gun became associated with liberation, with the end of Nazi tyranny. Photographs of emaciated survivors standing near British soldiers holding STENs became iconic images of the war's end. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, hundreds of thousands of STEN guns were in service with British and Commonwealth forces. The weapon had served throughout the war in Europe, from the desperate days of 1940 to final victory. It had armed regular troops, commandos, paratroopers, and resistance fighters. It had been manufactured in Britain, Canada, Poland, Denmark, Norway, and clandestinely in a dozen other countries. It had become one of the defining weapons of the war, not through excellence, but through availability and adequate performance when it mattered most. The Pacific Theatre saw less extensive STEN use, but still significant deployment. British and Commonwealth forces fighting in Burma found the weapon suitable for jungle warfare. The STEN's resistance to tropical conditions was mixed. The humidity caused rust and corrosion problems, but the simple design meant that damaged parts could be replaced easily. Indian Army units fighting in Burma used STENs extensively. The weapon proved effective in the close-range jungle fighting that characterized the Burma campaign. During the Battle of Imphal in 1944, Indian troops armed with STENs engaged Japanese forces in brutal close-quarters combat. The Chindits, British long-range penetration forces operating behind Japanese lines, carried STEN guns on their deep raids into Burma. The weapon's lightweight was essential for operations where forces had to be supplied entirely by air. Chindits moving through the jungle for weeks at a time found the STEN easier to carry than heavier weapons. Australian forces in the Pacific manufactured their own version of the STEN, designated the Austin. This weapon combined features of the British STEN and the German MP40, using the STEN's basic mechanism with the MP40's telescoping wire stock and pistol grip. The Austin was generally considered superior to the British STEN in build quality and reliability, though it was more expensive to produce. Australian troops used Austins throughout the New Guinea and Borneo campaigns, finding them effective in jungle warfare. Chinese forces also received STEN guns, though in relatively small numbers. The weapons were supplied through British and American channels to nationalist forces fighting the Japanese. The STEN simplicity made it suitable for Chinese forces that often lacked sophisticated maintenance facilities. However, the 9mm parabellum ammunition was not standard in Chinese service, limiting the weapon's usefulness. After the war ended, vast stockpiles of STEN guns existed. Britain had manufactured over 3.7 million, Canada over 130,000. Hundreds of thousands more had been produced clandestinely in occupied Europe. The question of what to do with these weapons became pressing. Many were simply destroyed or dumped at sea. Others were retained in British service, continuing to arm second-line troops and police forces. The STEN remained in British military service until the mid-1950s, when it was gradually replaced by the Sterling submachine gun. The Sterling, designed by George Patchett, addressed many of the STEN's weaknesses while retaining its basic simplicity. It featured an improved magazine, a curved design that improved feeding reliability. The mechanism was more refined, reducing the tendency to jam. The Sterling would serve British forces for another 40 years, but it owed its existence to lessons learned from the STEN. Many STENs found their way onto the surplus market, where they were purchased by foreign governments, police, forces, and eventually collectors. The weapon's simple design made it attractive to nations with limited defence budgets. Various armed forces across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East acquired surplus STENs in the decades after World War II. The STEN's most controversial post-war career was in the hands of insurgent and terrorist groups. The weapon's simplicity, availability, and concealability made it attractive to anyone seeking military weapons for irregular warfare. The IRA used STENs extensively during the Troubles, acquiring them through various channels including theft from British military depots. The weapon appeared in conflicts across the globe, often decades after the war ended. This dark legacy complicated the STEN's historical reputation. The same qualities that made it useful for resistance fighters battling Nazi occupation made it equally useful for terrorists and insurgents. The weapon couldn't distinguish between righteous causes and criminal violence. In the 1980s and 1990s, improvised submachine guns based on the STEN design appeared in conflicts worldwide. The fundamental simplicity of the design meant that anyone with basic metalworking skills could produce a functional weapon. Police forces from Brazil to Pakistan encountered locally made STEN copies used by criminals and insurgents. The STEN had demonstrated that firearms could be democratized, that the monopoly on weapons held by nation-states could be broken by anyone with determination and basic tools. This legacy is deeply troubling from a security perspective, yet it reflects the reality that Major Shepard and Harold Turpin created something that changed the nature of small arms forever. They proved that effective weapons could be simple, crude, and cheap. They demonstrated that in a conflict where resources mattered, simplicity was a feature rather than a bug. The technical specifications of the STEN tell only part of the story. On paper, it was an unremarkable weapon. 9mm caliber, blowback operation, 32-round magazine, 550 rounds per minute rate of fire. These were not exceptional characteristics. The German MP40 had similar specifications and was far better made. The American Thompson had superior construction and greater prestige. The Soviet PPSH-41 had a larger magazine and higher rate of fire. Yet the STEN accomplished something none of these weapons did. It armed a resistance movement on a continental scale. It could be manufactured in quantities that transformed strategic calculations. It gave Britain the means to continue fighting when conventional weapons production couldn't meet demand. The STEN's influence on subsequent military thinking was profound. The concept of the interim or emergency weapon, something crude but functional that could be produced quickly in crisis, became part of military planning. The American M3 grease gun, developed in 1942, was explicitly inspired by the STEN's philosophy. It used stamped metal construction and simplified design to create a weapon even cheaper than the Thompson it was meant to replace. The Soviet Union, despite having the excellent PPSH-41, developed the even simpler PPS-43 using stamped metal construction similar to the STEN. The Germans, as noted, produced the MP3008 copy in their final desperate months. The STEN had demonstrated that in total war, crude weapons produced in large numbers could be more valuable than refined weapons produced in small numbers. This lesson influenced Cold War planning. Military forces prepared emergency weapons designs that could be produced quickly if existing factories were destroyed. The STEN had proven that industrial capacity could be distributed, that weapons production didn't require specialized facilities. This decentralization of production capability became a strategic consideration in an era when nuclear weapons threatened to destroy concentrated industrial centers. The human stories behind the STEN are countless. Every weapon has stories, but few firearms were used by such diverse groups in such varied circumstances. British soldiers carried STENs from North Africa to Germany. Canadian troops used them in Italy and France. Polish resistance fighters manufactured them in basement workshops. French Maquis fighters received them in midnight parachute drops. Norwegian commandos used them in raids on German installations. Greek partisans fought with them in the mountains. Chinese soldiers carried them against the Japanese. Jewish fighters used them in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Israeli forces manufactured copies in underground workshops. Each STEN represented a story of industrial production, supply chain logistics, training, combat, maintenance, and survival. Some weapons saw extensive combat, fired thousands of rounds, and survived the war to become museum pieces or collector items. Others jammed on their first use and cost their users their lives. Some were carefully maintained and functioned flawlessly. Others were neglected and failed at critical moments. The statistical record of STEN production and use is staggering. Over 4 million manufactured, approximately 85,000 delivered to France alone. Tens of thousands dropped to other resistance movements. Hundreds of thousands used by British and Commonwealth forces. Millions of rounds of 9mm ammunition produced specifically for STEN use. Countless lives saved by its presence. Countless lives lost to its malfunctions. The weapon killed thousands of German soldiers in combat. It killed collaborators and traitors. It also killed innocents caught in the crossfire of resistance operations and reprisals. The STEN, like any weapon, was morally neutral. its value depended entirely on who held it and for what purpose. For historians evaluating the STEN's impact, the key question is counterfactual. What would have happened without it? In 1940, Britain faced invasion with insufficient weapons to arm its forces. The STEN, despite its flaws, provided a solution. It gave Britain the means to equip rapidly expanded forces without bankrupting the nation or waiting years for conventional weapons production to increase. Without the STEN, British resistance to invasion would have been significantly weaker. For resistance movements, the counterfactual is even more striking. Without weapons supplies, resistance groups could engage in sabotage, intelligence gathering, and passive resistance, but they couldn't fight. The STEN, delivered in tens of thousands by airdrops, transformed resistance from a primarily non-violent activity to armed insurgency. This transformation was strategically significant. Resistance forces tied down German troops who might otherwise have been deployed to critical fronts. They disrupted supply lines, destroyed infrastructure, and forced the Germans to maintain extensive occupation forces. The Allied Supreme Command estimated that the French resistance alone provided the equivalent of 10 to 15 divisions worth of combat power. This was made possible largely by weapons like the STEN. The weapon's simplicity also meant that resistance groups could manufacture their own copies, further multiplying its impact. The fact that Polish, Danish, and Norwegian resistance groups could produce functional weapons in clandestine workshops demonstrated the power of the STEN's basic design. This was never possible with more complex weapons. The psychological impact of the STEN on both Allied and Axis forces deserves consideration. For Allied troops and resistance fighters, the weapon's availability provided reassurance that they had the means to fight, even if they didn't particularly like the weapon itself. For German forces, the STEN became associated with partisan warfare and the constant threat of ambush. German soldiers in occupied territories understood that behind any door, in any village, there might be resistance fighters armed with STEN guns waiting to ambush them. This constant threat degraded morale and forced the Germans to deploy extensive forces for occupation duty. The STEN's distinctive appearance also made it instantly recognizable. The side-mounted magazine and skeletal stock created a silhouette unlike any other weapon. This recognition worked both ways. Resistance fighters carrying STENs were immediately identifiable as armed insurgents, making concealment more difficult. German propaganda often showed captured STENs as evidence of British interference in occupied territories, using the weapon as a symbol of Allied support for resistance movements. For collectors and historians today, the STEN represents a fascinating artifact of industrial warfare. Examples in museums show the evolution from the early Mark I with its complex components to the brutally simple Mark II to the more refined Mark V. The variety of markings, from British military proof marks to the Polish eagle to various resistance group identifications, tells the story of the weapon's global distribution. Original STENs in good condition are valuable collector pieces, particularly rare variants like the silenced Mark VI or resistance manufactured examples. The market for STEN guns reflects their historical significance. British military examples are relatively common, given the millions produced. Resistance manufactured STENs from Poland or other occupied countries are extremely rare and valuable, representing incredible historical significance. The crude manufacture of these weapons, often visible in rough welds and improvised components, tells the story of desperate production under constant threat of discovery and death. Each resistance manufactured STEN represents an extraordinary act of courage by the workers who produced it. The technical analysis of STEN reliability has been debated extensively in the decades since the war. Some veterans maintain the weapon was hopelessly unreliable, while others insist it worked perfectly when properly maintained. The truth lies somewhere between these extremes. The STEN's reliability was highly dependent on several factors. Magazine condition and loading technique were critical. Soldiers who understood to load only 30 rounds and to inspect magazine lips for damage experienced fewer problems. Those who loaded magazines to full capacity or used damaged magazines had constant failures. Cleanliness was essential. The open bolt design meant that dirt and moisture could easily enter the mechanism. In clean, dry conditions, the STEN was reasonably reliable. In mud, sand, or extreme moisture, reliability degraded rapidly. Proper maintenance made an enormous difference. The STEN was simple to disassemble and clean, but this had to be done regularly. soldiers who cleaned their weapons daily had far fewer problems than those who neglected maintenance. The quality of manufacture also varied significantly. British factory-produced STENs were generally well made despite their crude appearance. The stamped components were manufactured to adequate tolerances, and the weapons functioned as designed. Resistance-manufactured STENs varied wildly in quality depending on the skill of the workers and the materials available. Some were nearly as good as factory weapons, others were barely functional, prone to breakages and malfunctions. The STEN's ammunition sensitivity was also a factor. The weapon was designed for 9mm parabellum ammunition, manufactured to British military specifications. When used with ammunition of varying quality, particularly captured German ammunition, or resistance-manufactured rounds, reliability could suffer. The combination of all these factors meant that some soldiers had STNs that worked flawlessly, while others had constant problems. The weapon's reputation for unreliability was thus both deserved and unfair. It was deserved because the STEN did jam more frequently than more expensive weapons like the Thompson. It was unfair because many of the reliability problems were due to user error, poor maintenance, or using damaged magazines. Modern testing of preserved STEN guns has provided some objective data. When properly maintained and used with good quality ammunition and undamaged magazines, the STEN has a reliability rate comparable to other World War II submachine guns. When used with damaged magazines or poor maintenance, reliability drops dramatically. This confirms what many wartime users reported, that the STEN worked well for those who understood it, and was problematic for those who didn't. The STEN's accuracy was never exceptional. The short barrel, simple sights, and relatively high rate of fire made precision shooting difficult beyond close range. At ranges beyond 100 yards, the weapon was nearly useless for aimed fire. But this was true of most submachine guns of the era. The STEN was designed for ranges under 100 yards, where it was adequately accurate for its intended purpose. In room clearing and close-quarters combat, precision wasn't as important as rapid fire and ease of handling. The STEN's light weight and compact size made it easy to bring on target quickly, a critical advantage in sudden close-range encounters. The final assessment of the STEN must balance its significant flaws against its strategic importance. As a weapon, it was crude, often unreliable and unpleasant to use. Soldiers who carried it generally preferred almost any alternative. It lacked the craftsmanship of traditional British firearms and the prestige of American weapons, but as a strategic tool, it was brilliantly successful. It solved Britain's immediate crisis in 1940 by providing a weapon that could be mass-produced immediately. It armed resistance movements across Europe, enabling armed insurgency on a scale never before possible. It demonstrated that weapons could be simple, cheap, and effective simultaneously. The STEN's legacy is the democratization of firearms. Shepard and Turpin proved that effective weapons didn't require skilled craftsmen or expensive materials. They could be produced by semi-skilled workers in ordinary factories using stamped metal and simple welding. This realization changed warfare forever. The era of beautifully crafted firearms as works of art ended. The era of weapons as industrial products, manufactured like any other tool, began. The STEN stands as the symbol of this transition, a crude but effective tool that accomplished its mission and changed history. In museums across the world, preserved STEN guns sit in display cases, their skeletal stocks and side-mounted magazines instantly recognizable. Each one represents a piece of history, a story of desperate production, clandestine distribution, or combat use. They are not beautiful weapons, they are not particularly sophisticated, but they are weapons that mattered, that changed the course of the war, that gave ordinary people the means to fight tyranny. The STEN gun overwhelmed occupying forces not through excellence, but through availability, not through refinement, but through crude effectiveness, not through prestige, but through sheer numbers. It was exactly what the moment required, and history records that sometimes adequate and available beats perfect and scarce. The occupation forces of Nazi Europe discovered this truth at the cost of their domination, and the crude British submachine gun, despised by so many who carried it, became one of the weapons that won the war.